My name is Peter Turner. I'm the managing partner at Meyers, Friedberg Lewis, and on behalf of the firm, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this morning. This is our first, we call these breakfast briefings of 2015, and the topic being, or the title being, Don't Let a Cyber Attack Paralyze Your Business, Necessary Precautions You Must Take Now. It's pretty timely, and there's a lot going on. In a minute, I'll introduce our panel and turn it over to the panel. You have in front of you on the table, when you take a seat, a little brochure about Meyers Roman. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we're located down Chagrin Boulevard, and we are a full-service law firm. We respond to the needs of small and large businesses and individuals, pretty much the legal needs that they may have. The brochure lists out our practice areas. We are here and we are not only responding to situations locally, but also regionally throughout Ohio and outside of Ohio, and through a consortium that we belong to called Law Pact. We actually can handle and assist clients in situations internationally. Law Pact has member firms around the world. So take a look at that. You've also got a small device on ID theft, and I think one of the speakers may tell you about that and how that can be used. So this topic, cybersecurity, is hot now, and almost every day I get something announcing a new seminar or webinar. Yesterday I got one, and for a 90-minute webinar for $199, this is sort of typical of what you're getting. They call it How to Navigate the Data Breach Storm, Identifying the Risks and Managing the Aftermath. And just to kind of set the stage for what you'll be hearing, a number of confirmed data breaches they're expected to rise, and they will rise this year and into the future. It's more important than ever for companies to understand data security and how to protect one's business and customers. It's been said that there are two types of companies, those that have experienced a data breach and those that know they have experienced a data breach. In an age when companies place more value on their intellectual property than their bricks and mortar, data protection must be a priority. Data breaches may involve disclosure of financial information, personal health information, personally identifiable information, trade secrets, and intellectual property. Given the risks and significant costs of a breach, it's important to know in advance what to do to mitigate the risk of a breach occurring in the first place and appropriately manage the breach once it happens. So with that said, you're going to be hearing from three people this morning, and I'll introduce our panel. Peter Brosse is a partner in the firm of Meyers Roman. He is the chair of the business and corporate group. Peter has been practicing for in excess of 30 years, and those of you who know him know he is an extremely knowledgeable advisor, a trusted advisor. He's worked with lenders, venture capital, financial services, manufacturers, professional services, real estate development, pretty much any business you could think of, Peter has dealt with it, and he's dealt with all kinds of situations, including cyber issues. Peter frequently speaks on business issues, including startups, succession planning, year-end planning, real estate, and those topics I mentioned. And he is actively involved in the community and charitable organizations. You're also going to hear from Isaac Figueras, who's an associate with Meyers Roman. He is also in our business and corporate group. Isaac has worked on numerous business transaction mergers and acquisitions. He's taken a particular interest in cybersecurity and has really been a sponge and a tremendous resource for us when it comes to any issue relating to cybersecurity, including insurance issues relating to cybersecurity. And we also have, and we're pleased to have joined us this morning, Gary Sheehan. He is the Chief Security Officer at ASMGi. He's a certified security professional focused on providing governance, risk, security, and compliance solutions that align with the customer's business goals and objectives. ASMGi is a leading technical support and information technology services business in the Cleveland area, which provides connectivity, network infrastructure, data management, and security services to a variety of small and large businesses. So with that, I think I've said enough, and I'll turn it over to the panel.
Good morning. I'm Peter Brosse. Thanks for coming here today. I know it's early in the morning, but I want to pose a few questions to you. Do you think that your business or your client's business, your vendor's business is a target for a hacker? I'm going to use hacker in a very general term. Are you thinking maybe no, because I'm too small? It's only Target and JP Morgan that has to be concerned about those issues. What do you do if your business is hacked, or there's a cyber thief that's holding your data system hostage for ransom and your business is shut down? What are the consequences to your business if it's shut down for an hour, 10 hours, a day, 3 days, or longer because someone has hacked into your system? Do you know what to do if you've been hacked? Can your data be recovered? Can your business sustain the cost of a situation where you've lost data or your data has been absconded by another party? Can you pay government fines, and can you deal with the loss of productivity? Can these risks be addressed? I'll answer that question. Yes. Our clients at Meyers Roman are primarily closely held businesses. You would call them small businesses or medium-sized businesses. They're manufacturers, distributors, professional service providers. So this is not an issue that only big companies need to be concerned about. And even big companies, this is an article from the Plain Dealer. Apparently the Plain Dealer doesn't put dates on their paper anymore, but I think it's in the spring of last year. Contractor accused of Eaton cyber attack. Charges say he put malware on their computers. So if it can happen to Eaton, it can probably happen to you and your customers and to your vendors. Today, Isaac Figueras and Gary Sheehan and I will discuss with you why a small business needs to be cognizant of and address these issues, cybersecurity issues, and what can be done to mitigate and address the risk, and how to determine to what extent your business needs to address it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Isaac.
Good morning, everyone. So I heard that we were actually competing this morning with NPR on talking about cybersecurity. So thank you, everyone who came here instead of listening to it on your normal route to work. So this morning, I'm going to start with going through. This is the information for all of us in case anyone would like to email us after. You can also get the information at the end of the slideshow. But let's talk a little bit about why this is important. So we like to emphasize, as most people do, that this is not where but when for all businesses. A lot of people are asleep at the wheel right now. They think that I don't have important information or there's no reason for someone to target me, and frankly I don't have the money, so why should I be investing in this? And we'll start with, well, if you don't think you have the money for precautions, then you're definitely not going to have money to deal with the resulting damages when your business gets shut down from it. But there's another issue going on here. In 2013, attacks on small businesses and medium-sized businesses went up by 61%. And that continued in 2014. It's a growing trend that the new victims are not the large businesses. They're the small and mid-sized businesses. And really, at this point, about 1 in 5 businesses are getting hacked. Small businesses are being hacked. Now, that's pretty big numbers if you think about it. If you look around this room and think about from a business standpoint, almost at almost every table somebody's been hacked. And as far as individuals, 1 in 4 individuals have had their information lost at this point due to a business being hacked. So again, look around you. chances are it's either you or somebody right next to you that's just lost their information. Now, why is that? Well, it's because small businesses are not investing in these precautions. So for a hacker, you can either try to go after one of the major corporations, spend a lot of time breaking into their system, hopefully getting the information you want, or you can go after small businesses, take all of the information they have, put everything up for sale, and get what you can, because at this point it's considered low-hanging fruit. And they are easily attacked by a lot of different sources. Obviously, ransomware is the one that comes to mind. Now that, if anyone has seen the recent episode of The Good Wife, where one of the partners at the law firm on the show opens up an email, and all of a sudden every computer in the entire law firm gets a message that says, pay me $500, or I'm not releasing what you have. Well, that is actually happening, and small businesses are the ones it's happening to the most. And I've heard stories about small businesses that cannot recover from it unless they pay. And this is a big issue for big businesses too, because the small businesses and the mid-sized businesses, they're your vendors. Peter mentioned what happened with Eaton Corp about a year ago. Well, that's exactly why you need to be considering this. I've heard of programs at Key Bank. Recently, I heard that the chief information officer discussing how they are trying to work with the small businesses that are their customers or their vendors to help them recognize the precautions they need to take. So let's talk a little bit more about why. It's basically what I just told you. This is a gateway to larger businesses by going into the small business. There's often fewer protections. Even worse, when there are protections or it's a known issue, the protocols are often ignored. And whether it's your employees finding an easier way to share files to their home laptop or just not wanting to follow what they feel is a strict protocol, you might find that you've put a lot of time in making sure you're running your business correctly, but your employees aren't invested or knowledgeable in following what you've asked them to do. Now, no matter what, every business has valuable information, consumer information, confidential information, trade secrets that they can pull. And as I said, at this point, a hacker will go into your business, take every bit of information down to how you operate, and sell it for whatever price they can get. Now, what does this mean? There's a calculator out there released by IBM and the Ponemon Institute that asks you about 16 questions. And if you go through it, it will give you predictions on what kind of risk you have, your chance of being hacked in the next year, and what kind of damages you would see if you were hacked. I had the pleasure of running a survey on this with about 25 businesses. Interestingly, about 13 of them gave me results that were favorable. And that's what I have up here. The quote-unquote favorable result for a small business is to only have $100,000 worth of damages and to only have a 10 or 11% chance of being hacked in the next year. Now, these numbers really consider only losing about 5,000 records of consumers. What if it was 10,000 or 20? That number can go up exponentially. And don't be mistaken, the factors that decide where you fall are not just whether or not you put security protocols in place ahead of time. Obviously, that is the first thing you need to be thinking about, is how secure is my program, how secure is my network, am I encrypting my emails? But there are several other factors that heavily contribute to what your costs are. Industry is the largest. Unsurprisingly, the medical industry has the largest cost. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a large cost. In fact, manufacturers, anyone that works with consumers can have very high losses as well. What kind of information do you have? I've noticed a lot of programs and a lot of people focus on loss of consumer records. Let's be honest, most of us have to some level consumer records, but a lot of us work in the area of trade secrets or confidential information you're holding on behalf of your customers. If you work for larger businesses or smaller, you often have specifications from them that you could lose. So the only real difference there is if you lose that information and you're not sending out a notification, but you still need to call that business and sit down with them and explain why you just lost their confidential information. And that could be your top customer. Well, if it's 10, 20% of your revenue, all of the ramifications are still there. The only difference is you'll be in court over a breach of contract claim instead of losing somebody's information. Your geographic footprint, if you do anything overseas, not only do you have to worry about the laws in the US, but you have to worry about laws in the European Union and all over the place. What kind of organizational structure do you have? Oddly enough, two of the biggest factors in reducing your cost are if you've appointed a chief security officer and if your management team is actively involved in planning for a breach. And then you look at every other factor and it really comes down to common sense. Have you thought about this ahead of time? When you're breached, you're going to have costs. Whether or not it puts you out of business depends on if you do what we're talking about today. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Peter, and he'll start discussing how you can organize your business to be ready for a breach. And I'll be back in a few minutes to discuss who you're going to see at the other end of the court if you fail to take precautions. Thank you.
So one of the things that we have to at least come to grips with is it's not if, it's when you're going to have a security breach. So the issue then is, how do we start and what do we do? So what we recommend is that you have a cybersecurity plan. And this should be part of your business's catastrophe plan overall. So the plan has three parts to it: prevention, detection, response, and recovery. So what's entailed? Well, first let's start with the issue of prevention. And as we've, I think, generally have told you today, it may be a bit of a misnomer because there's no way of totally preventing a security breach. So it's more of risk mitigation. And how do we reduce the risk and make it harder for the breach? So the first step is to have a cyber audit. And the cyber audit is really to figure out to what extent your business is exposed and to what extent of security do you need. And this will vary from business to business. So there's two pieces of it. The first is the technology piece, which Gary will talk about a little later. And then there's the non-technology piece, which I'm going to talk about right now. So when we consider the first issue, which is prevention, we have to consider where are our risks and threats. So in this diagram, you'll see you can start at home with your business and your employees, and you can go downstream to your vendors, contractors, subcontractors, and then we can go upstream to customers. And so when we look at this, we have to look at not only what our responsibility is, meaning the business's responsibility to its customers, but what are our vendors and others' responsibilities to us. So the first issue to really look at is workplace policies and employee policies. So why would we start there? Well, employees are really the weak link in any business when it comes to cybersecurity. Generally, the workplace policies will deal with facility security. Who has access to the servers? Who has access to different parts of your manufacturer, to different parts of your business? Identification badges. Who has access to information that's stored? Is it password protected? Do your employees use passwords? Do we have encryption? Do you have email policies? Second is, let's consider how many devices that our employees are using today. So we can have smartphones, tablets, computers, and so employees are basically connected to at least 3 devices at any time. And tablet use is increasing. So what we see an increase of is employees using their own devices for business purposes, or bring your own device, BYOD. So when a business has to consider what policies need to be considered here, one is, do you have, as a business owner, do you have access to that employee's smartphone, tablet? 2, who's in possession and control of that information, and who owns it? What can be stored and what is prohibited from being stored on an employee's device? Is the device password protected? Do we have an account management such that in order to get into the device, is there a password that has to be inputted? Is it locked? Is there a social media policy? Employees have a tendency to post a lot of things on social media. Is there a restriction on what can and can't be posted? Do you have a policy as to Wi-Fi? There are not, as you've probably experienced if you go to the airport, not all Wi-Fi is secured. Is there a restriction on using unsecured Wi-Fi? Are there restrictions on use of location services or GPS by employees? And I thought this was an interesting issue or policy, because people have a tendency to post where they are at all times. There is a way in which an attacker can then follow an employee and ultimately determine where they are and potentially for what purpose they're there. So it's an issue of confidentiality. Texting policies. As most of you probably know, texts don't go through your server, and they may not be saved by Verizon or other owners or other companies. And so there's a lack of ability to determine what an employee is communicating as it relates to the business. Again, it's lack of control by the employer. And we need to consider what happens if that device is lost. Is the employer able to lock it down and from a distance clean all the information off that device? Are you requiring that of your employees? What is and isn't stored on their device? Are you allowing them to have access to trade secret pricing information and other confidential information? So, and then the other issue, of course, is enforcement of the policies. You may have them, but are you enforcing them? And if so, how are you going to enforce them? And of course, then there's the old school non-disclosure and non-compete, which employees should be subject to, which also supports this. So then we have third-party risks. So can we mitigate these risks through contract? And ultimately, what are our responsibilities, or your business's responsibilities under your contracts currently? And what are your responsibilities of others to your business under contract? And do you require that there's a certain standard of cybersecurity met? Interesting in that if you were buying a business, is this an issue, cybersecurity an issue on your due diligence checklist? So there are a few contracts that I'll just briefly discuss. Website contracts. Your websites are typically hosted on a third-party server. What are the responsibilities of the host as it relates to security to your website? Can they financially support if there was a hack? Do they know how to respond? Are there certain standards that the host is supposed to be required to maintain? Vendor and subcontractor contracts. Do your vendors have access to your IT system? Some of you have IT contractors that are maintaining your system. Sometimes, as I've had a client that is going to write a program and as a result needed access into the system of his customer. Are you requiring that they maintain certain standards of cybersecurity? Is there an indemnification provision, which we'll talk about in a second? If there are regulations or industry standards, are they being maintained? Now, what I'm starting to see, and I've only seen it really one time in this situation where I had a client who was being contracted by a fairly large but not a public company to write a computer program, and they had a master contract. 3 pages of this 15-page, 20-page contract were just standards of cybersecurity, and they wanted them to meet ISO standards, and ultimately this is a small business. They're not going to be able to maintain it. So at this time, we were able to say, look, we'll maintain the security that we do for ourselves and our other customers, but we can't do any more than that. That company did some further due diligence and was satisfied. But as time goes on, I'm not sure that that is going to be as easily negotiated away as it was last summer. And then the issue is, in these contracts, who's responsible if there is a breach, if you have a vendor? Are your indemnification provisions in your customer contracts or your vendor contracts, are you inadvertently indemnifying your customer for a breach that occurs to you? These indemnification provisions, which, we all put them in. You don't think really too much twice about it, but they're general. A lot of times, they're very general. And it can be an act or omission, or it can be negligence, or it could be a result of just the fact that a third party you have caused damage to them. So you inadvertently may be responsible for a cyber breach to a customer that may have come through you, or you had put a virus or malware on their system inadvertently. And then, of course, there's cloud computing. Everybody loves to say, I'm putting information in the cloud. But what is the cloud? The cloud are third-party servers. So we have all the issues with these servers or hosts. Again, what are their responsibilities? Are they maintaining a standard? And since you're putting all your information in the cloud, you have to. It's not just a website. It becomes much more of an issue for you. Are they detecting and seeing that whether or not there are potential attacks to their system? And can they financially, do they know how to respond? Can they recover your information? And lastly, can they financially back up the costs of doing of this? So one of the pieces in our businesses is that we mitigate damages, you buy insurance. So most businesses will purchase commercial general liability policies, business interruption, crime or employee theft, maybe an E&O or professional liability insurance. And, but the issue is, do these policies cover the costs if you have a data breach? Maybe, maybe not. So take business interruption. If your business is shut down as a result of a data breach, you would make a call, say you have business interruption insurance, and make a claim. But the question is, does your business interruption insurance cover a data breach? Interestingly enough, a number of business interruption coverage only covers interruption as a result of a casualty, fire, earthquake, flood, that type of thing. A non-hazard, cybersecurity, which requires your business to shut down, may not be covered. So does a commercial general liability policy cover data breach? Well, it may or may not, but the issue has been litigated a couple of times on under the issue of personal injury, believe it or not, and whether a number of policies indicate there's a personal injury where there is an oral or written publication, and the issue is publication, in any manner that violates a person's right of privacy. So some courts where personal identifiable information or medical records have been posted on websites or have been able to be obtained by the public have determined that that is a publication, there has been a violation of person's privacy, and have found coverage. But you can't put all your balls in that court. So there is a product, cyber insurance policy or endorsements, and the question is, what does it cover? So generally, they'll cover third-party claims arising from a hack or a theft of information, destruction of data, cover investigation costs to assess the attacks, costs of response, notices, monitoring of the business, business interruption, regulatory actions that result from the security breach, and potentially physical damage to the computers, the hardware, and the software system. But what you have to be very cognizant of is that in any contract, the devil's in the details. So what is covered and what is excluded? And so when looking at this policy or endorsement, you have to consider what is excluded. So for example, does a policy cover extortion when your data is held for ransom? And the costs of the policy will vary depending upon obviously what your coverage is. And then you also have to determine, as part of the audit, to what extent you need coverage. And determine what your risks are. Are you subject to HIPAA, for example? Are you keeping Social Security numbers and credit card information, which hopefully you're not, on your system? The second part of your plan is detection. And what this entails is the regular and continuous monitoring of your system, your updating of your firewalls and virus malware protection, and having your IT people determine whether they've indicated that people have that they've seen potential attacks, and the key here is really the updating of malware and doing this on protection and doing this on a regular basis. The last piece of this is response. So it's happened. You've been hacked, and what do you have to do? And your plan should already lay out to what extent you have statutory obligations. And as Isaac will talk to you in a little bit, there are federal, state, and international laws that will require response, and in a very short period of time. So it's important to know what you need to do. You should be identifying people in your business and have a team so that so that when it's time to respond, these are the individuals that will know who to call and what to do. Now, we've had clients say to us, well, it's just me. But that's when you put your outside team together. You put your IT person, and as you'll see, and other professionals that you can call upon that will be able to respond. And one piece in the response is crisis communication. You know, what do you have a concern of loss, not only of money, but loss of your reputation and loss of confidence from your customers, your employees, and how do you manage that? And what kind of information, or how do you want to project yourself to the public in response to these situations? And the last piece is restore. How do you get your information restored? And how are you backing up your information currently? Is your office manager still taking tapes home with her at the end of each week? If that office manager doesn't show up voluntarily or involuntarily one day, you have no ability to get your information back. So it's, that is how you're storing, what you're storing and how you're storing is very important. I appreciate your attention. Isaac will now tell you about your legal requirements.
So as an attorney, this is probably my favorite part that I get to discuss with you. So you've been breached. You've had an employee do something negligent. You've had a malicious attack, or my personal favorite, you have an antiquated system that glitched and it made information vulnerable. Who do you have to answer to? I mean, obviously you have to answer to your customers or the consumers whose information you lost, but let's talk a little bit about the different actors, state, federal, or regulatory, that might come after you and say that you need to pay fines. So first you have your state laws. Currently, state laws govern breach notifications. And the last I saw, there's at least 47 states that currently have a law in place. Now, these generally will require you to notify consumers that you've lost their information if that information you lost is social security numbers, credit card numbers, driver license numbers, and there is a chance that the person who now has the information is going to use it to commit a fraud of some sort. Now, that is a very generalized look. The difficulty is that every state has come up with its own interpretation of that basic model. So if you are operating throughout the United States, you need to make sure that whatever notification you're sending out complies with all of them. And believe me, for those of you who thought that Home Depot and all of these companies were offering you 1 to 2 free years of credit monitoring to be nice, they weren't. That's what they have to do at this point in order to make sure that they don't have the state's attorney general knocking at their door and saying, in addition to the lost business, you have to pay me now. Federal laws and regulators are pretty industry specific at this point. Now, some of us have seen that the president has tried and discussed on numerous occasions putting in general breach notification requirements or general minimum security requirements, but has had very little success in actually getting these ideas to make headway and become a full federal law. That has not stopped several different regulators from stepping into this area. Now, the SEC has played a large role in this. If you're a publicly reporting company, there's certain things that you have to report on it, but the one that stands out and that you need to keep an eye on currently is the FTC. Now, they're saying that it is an unfair or deceptive trade practice not to take precautions ahead of time if you hold consumer information. So that means that you can be fined if you didn't go through and conduct an audit or think about this ahead of time and take some precautionary measures. And there's other things that these regulators are looking at or that federal laws are looking at. They have some specialized breach notifications. They often have reasonable security requirements, and some even require you to have record retention and destruction policies or to pass those policies on to your third parties that you're selling to. A good example is credit reporting agencies. Credit reporting agencies are not allowed to give credit reports to entities unless by contract the people receiving the reports are destroying them in a certain way within a certain time. Other things that you need to consider, if you contract with the Department of Defense, and don't tell me if you do, I don't want to hear it, but if you do, you need to have very specific requirements and procedures in place for the information you're handling with them. Now that's just a taste. That means that when you're conducting your audit, you really need to think about what industry you're in. You need to talk with your legal counselor and your IT provider about what industry standards are applicable to you so that you're following the right one. Now upcoming, we've just seen the announcement of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. That's a mouthful. It's kind of uncertain what they're going to be doing yet, but from what we understand, when President Obama announced this, they're going to be a hub between agencies. I know currently there's several that are working on it, including the FBI, going to different businesses after a breach, discussing with them how to respond, who caused the breach, how to reply to it. This is supposed to help unify what is currently a very difficult area to navigate because so many different agencies are putting their hands on it in different ways. Now, I don't want you to think that the only people you need to answer to after a breach are the regulators. We've seen private actions for breach of contract. For those of you who work primarily in trade secrets, that's where you're going to be concerned, is if your top customer is suing you because you breached an NDA or a confidentiality agreement by not having the right requirements and having a breach. You can also see class actions from individuals. Now, these have had varied success, but Target had over 100 class actions filed against it following Target's breach. Now, regardless of whether or not those class actions succeed, that's a lot of expenses that get paid to me and to other attorneys who are really the ones winning here. And then your credit card issuers, all of the companies that are having to reissue credit cards are getting together and suing the people who had the breach because that is expensive to reissue credit cards following, say, Home Depot's breach. So what do? How do you keep that fine down? What's reasonable is the question you need to be asking. And as we move into Gary's part of the presentation, you're going to get a taste of what an audit is and how you can decide what's reasonable for your business. A lot of this are questions we've already asked you. Take a look at the information that your company carries so that you know what industry or federal regulations and standards you need to follow. What is reasonable in relation to your circumstances? Now, just because you might be a small company, you might not need the same level of precautions that one of the major companies has, but you still need to take some steps. What did you do retroactively? A lot of companies wait until they're breached to start putting in standards. That is a big difference in cost and what you're going to have to pay. And have you conducted your cybersecurity assessment? Now, this is not without hope. This is not going to be a process that has to be all-intensive, time-consuming. You aren't going to be able to focus on your business because you need to do your cybersecurity. If you have good professionals, this can help you make your business better. And the first step is figuring out where you stand. Now, I always like to mention how the FTC actually thinks about this because they're the ones who are kind enough to tell us what they're looking at when the business has been breached and they're deciding what kind of fine they want to go after them for. This is a constant process. If you did this 5 years ago and you say, oh, I'm good, I did this a couple years ago, I'm all set, you're in trouble because this is changing so quickly that you need to be addressing this at least yearly, often twice a year or more. Again, your procedure needs to be reasonable in relation to your circumstances. If you have 3 people in your company, we can work with that. We can give you standards that you can follow. If you have 100 people or more, again, we can work with that. You just need to know what works for you. And just because you've been breached does not mean you failed. It's going to happen. But the fact that you haven't been breached yet doesn't mean you're succeeding. In fact, it might just mean, like I said earlier, you're asleep at the wheel. Now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology released a booklet that kind of described the process you should have in place, which is what Peter and what Gary will say going forward has several components. Identify where you stand and what kind of information you have. Protect it, detect your breach, respond to your breach, and recover. You're going to see those words on almost every slide for the rest of this show. I hope that that reminds you what you need to be doing going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who will walk through the first step, identifying and protecting, and give you a taste of what a real cybersecurity audit will be. Thank you.
All right, so let's see, there we go. So before we can determine what is reasonable, as Isaac was talking about, I think we first need to understand what is cybersecurity. I mean, we've talked about it now for about 45 minutes. And I think it's a term that's sort of new but not, and sort of understood but not. And I think a lot of people, I think understand it in a different way. So I wanted to put a definition up there when you talk about cybersecurity. I know that when I go out to clients and we mention cybersecurity, the first thing they want to know is, well, do a pen test and a scan and we're good, right? And that's not at all the case. Cybersecurity really is the body of technologies, standards, processes, procedures, practices designed to protect your networks, computers, and critical data. So what do? You think about information security and cybersecurity, and when it comes right down to it, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. It just became a term because so much information was going out in this cyberspace. So, we need to apply those controls, those protections. But at the end of the day, it's the same controls and protections that we should have been applying in our companies for years and years and years and years. Because I think really when you talk about the issues we're having today with all the breaches, yeah, they got hacked, their website got defaced, you talk about all these technology problems, but the root cause of these problems really rely within the companies in their practices, in their broken policies, in their broken procedures, in the practices they use that maybe aren't the best practices for security. Cybersecurity should be all about risk management. It really shouldn't be, we have to put these controls in to stop this. You heard Peter and Isaac talk now about all these different things you have to do or should do, and that's true. But before you implement those or determine how far you go with those controls, you really need to address the risk. What is the risk? And what is the impact to the organization for this information? Because perhaps not all of the risks are addressable, or do you need to address them? It depends, again, at the level of those risks. When we talk about reviewing or assessing cybersecurity posture, we need to use a more holistic approach. It's not just, do my pen test, do my vulnerability management. And I think using a holistic approach really helps you identify the risk and helps you manage the risk, because it's not just looking at your applications or your systems. It's forcing you to look at those policies, those procedures, those practices and standards that organizations use in order to support that technical environment. So what's the old saying? An ounce of protection is worth a pound of cure, right? And I think that's exactly the case today, is by spending some money up front to be prepared, because it's most likely going to happen, you'll be much better off at the end of the day, because you'll be ready to respond, ready to recover. You'll be able to detect all those things that we talked about earlier. Isaac and Peter talked about being able to accomplish within your organization. It's all about being prepared. So what's the best way? use a framework. Frameworks build this holistic assessment that I just talked about. And it looks at your environment from an administrative standpoint, that being your policies, procedures, all your documentation. From a physical standpoint, what's your physical security look like? What's your technical environment look like? And most recently, over the last couple years, we've added a couple more approaches. The whole legal landscape of your cybersecurity, as well as your supplier and provider services. So we're going to step through these in a little more detail. So we talk about using a framework. What's a framework? Well, I think the biggest mistake many companies make today is they say, well, we use PCI as our framework, or we use HIPAA as our framework. And regulations are not frameworks. Regulations are a group of controls that an industry or the government put together to say, here's what you should do to protect that specific data. There's many more things you should do in your organization many times for other information. So what we talk about is we talk about using frameworks like there's a tool out there called the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool, or the NIST. One of my favorites is the ISO 27001 and 2 set of the framework and the set of controls that go with that. COBIT 5 for information security was recently released, maybe within the last year or two. These are frameworks that force you to look at your information security or your cybersecurity environment in a holistic manner, so you don't miss any of those, gotchas at the end of the day. So the biggest thing with this is frameworks do not equal government regulations. If you're going to put together a security program, build the foundation of that program using a framework, not a regulation. So let's first talk about administrative assessments. Now, Peter talked a lot about this, policies, procedures. What do you assess on those? Well, again, you go back to the frameworks, because frameworks will tell you, number one, what sort of policies you should have, what sort of procedures you should have, what should be in your policies, what types of procedures you need to have in order to support different parts of your environment. What are the standards? And a big thing today for the administrative piece is the training. Every regulation, as well as every security standard or framework, calls for training. It requires your organization to train your individuals on how to use technology properly and how to from the whole policy and procedure and standpoint, how to use that environment safely. Then we get into the physical stuff. So you think, what does physical have to do with cybersecurity? Well, you go back to the whole Stuxnet thing, and how did that happen? That was more of a physical breach in the beginning than a technical breach that happened at the end. So physical security is just as important. It's an important component, just like technical and administrative. You need to look at your physical security for your organization. Is your data center protected? Are your workstations physically protected? Are your employees physically protected? And to what degree? Do you require card swipes or key locks to get into certain areas or to access your employees? Are you in a public building, private building? Are you near the road, off the road? All those kind of things come into consideration when you look at your physical security environment. For manufacturing companies, that becomes even a bigger issue, because you not only are protecting your office space, but you also have to protect your plants. And that's really where many of the, I would say many of the manufacturing companies kind of fall a little bit by the wayside. They do a pretty good job on their business environment, but when it gets to their operational technology environment, not so good, because they're focused on creating the product, right? Not so much on securing these huge plants, acres and acres of space that they have to take care of. Part of this physical inventory is doing this walkthrough. So you do you look at all of the access points as well as the assets. Having an asset inventory as part of this physical security thing is huge. If you don't know what you have, how do you know what to protect? And if you don't know the value of what you have, how do you know how much protection to give that particular asset? So those are two big components within this physical security space. The next is this technical assessments, and I'm sure that we're all familiar with these. We talk about penetration tests, vulnerability assessments, application assessments. ASMGi is involved in doing pen testing for companies, and probably starting, I'm going to guess, maybe 3-4 years ago, we started collecting data on what we were finding from penetration testing companies. And not surprisingly to us, but probably surprising to many companies, is that about 90% of the issues we were finding, of the exploitable vulnerabilities we were finding during a pen test, were application related. What does that mean? That means that most companies do a good job on protecting their systems with patches, making sure their systems were up to date, making sure maybe they were physically secured, putting in some of the right procedures on maintaining that environment. But their process around application development and moving that into production were very, very lacking. So what we've been talking about lately to many of our customers is beefing up that whole application security development side of your technical infrastructure. The last component on here, again, is mainly manufacturing, the whole industrial control system environment. When we talk about cybersecurity, again, for many companies, we would go and do our assessment, and they didn't want us to touch their control systems, and rightly so, because they're running the business, and IT people may or may not know a lot about the control system environment. But if you want to, again, be prepared, and you want to make sure that you're doing a thorough assessment, you need to include that environment in your cybersecurity audit or your cybersecurity assessment. And sometimes that does take a special talent. So I know that when we go out and we do industrial control system assessments or audits, we bring a physical security expert, we bring an engineer, and we bring somebody that's versed in the frameworks for security as well as the administrative controls. So it's, I think it was Isaac that talked about getting that team involved in this cybersecurity program, and that's really what you need to do in order to be effective. You need to get the team involved with the different talents that can address the areas to help uncover those exploits so that you can reduce the risk in those areas. Legal assessment. Now, this is something that we've started, we meaning ASMGi, we started doing quite often now. If we're asked to do some sort of a cybersecurity assessment, especially in the manufacturing space, but also in other industries, it's important to get that legal advice. I was told not to use a certain word, so I'm not going to use it here, but legal advice from either your internal legal staff or from an external provider on what is appropriate, what is reasonable for your environment. I can help you identify the controls as they're specified by the framework, and I can give you some help as to meeting some of those regulatory requirements. But when it comes down to it, it's important to have that legal advice at the back end to make sure that you're covered from that aspect. And I think that's becoming more and more important because once, and hopefully not, but once you are breached, you have done your due diligence both in the technology space and the legal space to make sure you're protected. So there's a lot of things that Peter and Isaac talked about from a legal advice perspective, and I think those are all very much, they're important and they're pertinent to this type of assessment. Making sure you get that information and making sure you bounce those things off of either your internal or some sort of external legal expert. This is the fifth part of this, and it's interesting because not up until, I guess maybe starting a few years ago, yeah, we were all concerned about our supplier and our vendor partners in helping us, either produce our widgets or provide services or products to our customers. What's become even more important in many industries now is the requirement that you know, many of the security controls that I need to have in place as the main entity, I need to make sure that my suppliers and third-party service providers have those same controls implemented within their environment. So it's become very important for, as part of this whole cybersecurity assessment or audit process, to include your third-party providers, and this includes all of your cloud providers. It's amazing. We work with a partner that helps to identify, you know, cloud services, and we've been working with them for about a year now. And it's staggering even for me. I thought, well, there's, you know, probably a few thousand cloud providers out there. Not many. Well, they track over 10,000 cloud service providers. They track what those providers do, what kind of category they fall into, what's the risk of using those providers, and they can help organizations find out what cloud services they're using. A tremendous service, especially when it comes to risk management and understanding what your suppliers, what your third-party providers do, especially if they're cloud providers. Now, if they're not, and they're providing you other services, there are other ways to do that assessment as well. The key point here, though, is when you do your cybersecurity assessment or your audit, don't ignore your third-party providers. They have to be part of that. And in essence, you really should be doing an assessment of each provider as they're coming on board, and then an annual assessment to see if anything has changed over the last year. And I think Isaac talked a little bit about that. It's not just a one and done thing. It's this process that you have to have implemented on an ongoing basis. And those are the things that the frameworks talk about having as well. So if you use a framework to do even these third-party service providers, you're gonna catch those broken processes, those broken procedures, and those inadequate policies that you might find within an organization. So, in summary for what I have, I know it's pretty quick, but when you do cybersecurity, think more holistically. Don't think just technology. Think about all the underlying root causes of what's happening today and what you might need to look at as part of the assessment. Consider using a framework, a security framework, and we mentioned a few of them in the past. If at all possible, don't base your framework on any kind of a regulation. Yeah, those are good and you're going to have to follow those. But at the end of the day, many of the controls, in fact, I haven't found one yet, many of the controls within these government regulations like HIPAA and the industry regulations like PCI, they all map back to the controls within the frameworks. So it's great. If you can build this environment where you have your framework, you map your different controls, requirements from all these regulations, now you just have one area that you have to look at because you've mapped these out to the different regulations. So it becomes a lot easier then to manage within your environment. And the third part here is assessments. Make sure that when you do an assessment, you do a thorough assessment. You do an administrative review, you do a physical security review, you do your technical review, you do your legal due diligence, and then you include your suppliers and your vendors in your audits or your assessments. And I think for me that does it. I think we have some time for questions, so I'll turn it over to Isaac.
Is there any difference in security between iPhones, Android devices, BlackBerry devices, or are they all kind of, you know, equal in terms of their vulnerability?
So the question is if there is a difference in security between the different devices, iPhones, BlackBerries, et cetera, or if they're kind of standard across the board. Let's start with Gary. Do you have
Well,
any comments on
in
that?
my opinion, at the highest level, it's not necessarily the technology, but how you implement that within your environment. Whether you want to go with the iPhone or whether you want to go with the Android is purely a business decision. And I think both can work within an organization, but they can't be implemented in the same approach. So I know that's kind of a cop-out, but I don't, you know, if somebody needs...
What about BlackBerry?
BlackBerry has always been kind of that corporate staple from a security perspective, because your BlackBerry server is generally housed within your environment, so it's not really necessarily going out to the cloud.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It depends on the organization. You can use cloud services securely, so it's not necessarily a bad thing to use like an iPhone and use a cloud service for that. But you just have to make sure you have the right controls in place to do that. And based on your organization, there may be more risks in going with the iPhone approach or the Android approach, but that's an assessment that the organization would have to do to make that determination.
And what about the strength of encryption in these devices? Are they different?
I'm not sure that they're so different that it makes a difference. I'm sure there is a difference there in the types of encryption that they're each using. But I'm not sure that it's so wide that you would say, well, we can't use that because it's not well encrypted, if you know what I mean. So again, at the end of the day, with the technology and the services changing, my answer might be different tomorrow than it is today. When you go to that, when you decide to make that move and that approach, that's when you need to do your research to figure out, all right, what platform should we go to based on what the current situation is and where we think those companies are going to go.
Yes?
Yeah, sort of a comment and a question. I know dealing with our clients at TAP, we deal with situations, and one of the most critical, I think, issues in the timeline has to do with detection. I mean, the average detection time is 6 months, believe it or not, and you take somebody like Target, they discovered it in 8 weeks. Well, that's pretty darn good, but you can have these things out there. I think clients understanding and being proactive in terms of the detection will be critically important. And then you also talked about the various legal aspects of this. I know that there are 47 states with statutes focused on notification. Some states don't have any. The federal law is a little bit uncertain, but there are also, I guess, depending on the industry, some preemption issues. Like, for example, the Grand Wiley Act might come into play if you're dealing with a financial institution. Can you talk a little bit about how that overlay of certainly in the federal law and the various state laws can sort of complicate the regulatory aspect of compliance, if you will?
So the question is how the conflicts between state and regulatory laws can create issues when you're following all of them. And I think that's part of the reason that this new entity has been announced is there's a lot of confusion right now, and I think the best bet for most people following a breach is to just make sure you're following all of them without regard to who's preempting who. I mean, you take the state notification laws as a good example. There has been questions about what would happen if a general federal law were to come out, whether or not they'd be preempted. And I think the issue is there's so many different regulatory actors and state actors jumping into this right now. I mean, even the FCC a couple months ago came out with its first decision on it, hitting a company with an incredibly large fine that people aren't totally sure what to expect. And so the best thing you can do is to consistently be reviewing what kind of laws might apply to you, whether it's industry specific or general. And if you do have a breach, or when you do have a breach, making sure that you're following all of them, because it's so young that trying to go across the board is not realistic at this point.
One more question, as it relates to boards of directors. There have been litigation where they've been sued based upon, failing to implement proper procedures, and, I know in one recent case they won based upon the business judgment rule. Are D&O insurance policies covering this sort of thing?
So the question is, are D&O insurance policies covering failure by directors to take action? Do either of you have a comment on that particular issue?
That's pretty new, and it's just something.
There's somebody here that has their hand raised.
I can give you a hint to that. To the degree the directors themselves have failed to do their duty, the policy is going to respond. But it only responds for the liability of the directors, doesn't necessarily respond for the liabilities of the company unless they've bought corporate coverage. And it is it is not necessarily a bucket of cash that's going to pay for insurance that should have been purchased otherwise. Okay? There's an exclusion in the D&O policy that says this is not your catch-all to, you know, dump all your losses that you neglected to purchase insurance for.
I think ultimately the devil is in the details on the insurance policies, and there might be some coverage.
We're talking about all these laws against the companies. What do they do to the hackers? It seems like it's a slap on the wrist. So what are the laws that actually have any teeth in them that would prevent a hacker from doing this type of stuff?
I mean, the question is what laws regulate the actual hackers and going after them. I think that is tripping on some pretty worldwide issues, frankly, because at this point the hackers are all over the place. And it's kind of hard to catch them pretty often and actually take action against them. Like, Peter, did you want to?
No, I was going to say, when your hackers are in Russia or China, the U.S. laws aren't going to be able to help in that perspective.
How about the ones that are here?
Well, if they can be found and they're prosecuted, and I believe there's federal and state laws that are felonies for doing it. But at the end of the day, when you read these cases, there's no question you have your domestic hackers, but a lot of it is a result of overseas hacking.
I think there's basically a fairly naive perception in America that the domestic hackers are the ones causing most of the problems, and that when I do get breached, that my data remains domestic. It's not at all that way. There's a black data market that is evolving very, very rapidly, that is worldwide. And if they can get your credit card numbers or your social security numbers, in the blink of an eye, they're in Romania, in the blink of an eye, they're in Nigeria. They're being sold, they're being marketed, they're being auctioned on a block. And there's bidders sitting out there waiting for data. So it's becoming, as sophisticated as we are becoming in our protection measures, the black data market is becoming just as sophisticated. So don't be naive and have a perception that it's domestic.
I think we have time for one more question. I know you, sir, in front, you've been waiting. So.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, what is industry doing, maybe on a priority basis, for the bring your own device security? Now, I'll kind of throw into that, you sort of written my life. Possibly the largest breach potential, if not actual, that we've had in the history of our country is Hillary Clinton running the international business. This is unbelievable. On a private server in the house. What's industry doing?
So the question is, what is industry doing to address the BYOD movement? And I think that across the security board, you're seeing that one of the easy and most common things to do is to take a step back and look at what we were doing a year ago, and that was give them a phone, a company phone. And that we're starting to see an increase in saying, okay, you can sign this stack of documents, giving us complete access and basically making your phone our phone. Or you can have a second phone. Now, do either of you have a...
Well, there are some technologies out there that can really help, and I think there's some basic principles around security that we've gotten away from, that I think if we re-employ those will help. And that is protecting the data at its source and not necessarily at the device level. So being more data-centric with our security controls. And by that I mean there are some technologies out there that allow you to access your data on a mobile device in an encrypted, secure fashion, but prevents you from storing that data on that device. So now it doesn't matter if it's your device or the company's device. Yes, you can access it, yes, you can see it, but you can't store it. And if you employ the technology on that device, requiring either a PIN or some sort of access control to activate that device, now you've got a second layer of security there. So there are some things that that are happening today that allow us to use mobile devices in a more secure fashion and really take the concern of whether that's a personal device or a corporate device out of the picture. Now, that said, companies really need to make that, still need to make that decision. What's the risk of allowing this, and what's the cost of implementing those controls? So it's really going back to that risk and reward thing. And working with clients, I've seen a lot of different approaches to making sure that those devices are secure, whether, again, it's at the device level or the data level.
Well, I think that that's about all the time we have. We promised we'd have you out by 9, and we're a couple minutes past that. So if you have further questions, that all of us will be around for a few minutes after. We'd be happy to answer them. But other than that, thank you all for coming today, and we appreciate you listening.